They didn't just ignore him. They erased him, like he was never meant to be seen. The glass doors of Hale Dynamics slid open with a quiet hiss, letting in a rush of cool, conditioned air that carried the faint scent of polished marble and expensive ambition. And right there on the edge of that perfect corporate symmetry stood Ethan Cole, holding a worn leather folder in one hand, his other hand resting briefly in his pocket as if reminding himself why he had come at all, while just beyond him, a line of sharply dressed executives moved like clockwork, heels clicking, voices low and confident, every movement rehearsed by years of power and expectation. And then she appeared, Victoria Hale, the CEO, her presence slicing through the room with quiet authority, her heels echoing once, twice, 3 times against the marble floor, each step measured, each glance deliberate, her tailored suit flawless, her posture unyielding. And for a moment, Ethan lifted his eyes, not with arrogance, not with desperation, just with calm recognition, as if he understood something the room did not. But she didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't even flick her gaze in his direction. Not when the security guard stepped forward, not when the folder in Ethan's hand caught the light, not even when he spoke. "I'm here to help with the system review," his voice steady, quiet, almost swallowed by the vast lobby. And the guard gave a short laugh, the kind that wasn't cruel enough to be called out, but sharp enough to be felt. "Yeah, I don't think so," he said, already guiding Ethan back toward the door, and behind them, a few employees exchanged glances, one whispering just loud enough, "Probably lost," another adding, "Or trying to get in somewhere he doesn't belong." And Ethan didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't demand attention. He simply nodded once, slow and respectful, as if the dismissal itself was something he had learned to carry without resistance. While across the lobby, Victoria paused only long enough to sign a document handed to her, her pen gliding across the page with practiced ease, her assistant leaning in with a quick update about a multi-million-dollar contract waiting upstairs, and the world continued to orbit her without interruption, without question, without noticing the man being quietly turned away at the door. And for a brief second, the reflection in the polished floor caught them both in the same frame, the powerful son moving forward, the unnoticed father stepping back, and the distance between them felt wider than the entire building, because it wasn't just about status. It was about who was seen and who was not. And as the doors began to close behind him, Ethan glanced once more at the interior, not with regret, not with anger, but with a kind of stillness that didn't belong to someone defeated. And under his breath, barely audible even to himself, he said, "You might want to check your system before noon." And then he stepped outside into the warm morning air, leaving behind a world that had already decided who he was, unaware that in less than an hour, that same world would be forced into a silence it could not ignore. The morning sun had barely climbed past the neighboring glass towers when Ethan Cole's old pickup truck rattled into the gravel driveway of a modest 2-bedroom home on the edge of town, its faded blue paint catching just enough light to hint at better days. And inside, the engine ticked softly as it cooled, a quiet rhythm that matched the steady pace of a man who had long ago learned to live without urgency. Because urgency belonged to people who expected things to work out, and Ethan did not expect. He prepared, he adapted, he endured. And as he stepped out, adjusting the worn strap of his leather folder, the scent of cut grass and distant traffic wrapped around him like something honest, something real, far from polished lobbies and filtered air. And before he could even reach the front door, it opened, and a small voice called out, "Daddy," soft but bright, carrying more warmth than any corporate welcome ever could. And there stood Lily, her light brown hair slightly tangled, her sneakers mismatched, holding a sketchbook against her chest like it mattered more than anything else in the world. And Ethan's expression shifted, just slightly, the corners of his eyes softening, the weight in his shoulders easing. "Hey, kiddo," he said, kneeling just enough to meet her halfway as she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. A hug that was not rushed, not distracted, but full, complete, the kind of moment that did not need witnesses to matter. And inside the house, the air carried the faint smell of cinnamon toast and old wood, the kind of place where every creak in the floor had a memory attached to it. And Lily pulled back, holding up her sketchbook. "I drew something new," she said, flipping it open to reveal a careful drawing of a tall building with shining windows and a small figure standing outside. And Ethan looked at it quietly, studying the details, the way the lines leaned just slightly, the way the figure stood apart, but not broken, and he smiled, not wide, not loud, but real. That is really good, he said, his voice low and steady, and Lily beamed. That is where you went today, right? She asked, and Ethan nodded once. Yeah, something like that, and she tilted her head, curious in the way children are when they still believe answers are simple. Did they like you? She asked, and for a moment, just a moment, the question hung in the air, delicate and honest, and Ethan exhaled slowly, not avoiding, not dismissing, just choosing his words with care. They did not really see me, he said, and Lily frowned slightly, not understanding. How can someone not see you? She asked, and Ethan reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch calm, grounding. Sometimes people are looking at the wrong things, he said, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that did not need to prove itself. And she thought about that, her small brow furrowing, then nodded as if accepting something she could not fully explain, and together they moved into the kitchen, where Ethan poured her a glass of milk, the sound of it filling the silence between them, steady and simple. And on the counter sat a small pile of bills, neatly stacked, each one a reminder of a life built inch by inch, without shortcuts, without applause. And as Lily sat at the table, swinging her legs slightly, she looked up again. Are you going back there? She asked. And Ethan paused, his hand resting on the edge of the counter, his eyes drifting for a second toward the window where the city skyline barely touched the horizon, distant and indifferent. Maybe, he said, not with doubt, not with hope, just with that same quiet resolve. And then, almost as if speaking to something deeper than the moment itself, he added, sometimes doing the right thing is not about being invited. And outside, far beyond their small home, inside a building of glass and steel, a system continued to run with a flaw no one had yet noticed, ticking forward toward a moment that would not ask for permission before it changed everything. Back in the upper floors of Hale Dynamics, the atmosphere had shifted into something sharper, tighter, like the air before a storm that no one could quite name. And inside the executive conference room, walls of glass framed a skyline that looked steady and unshaken. But beneath that polished calm, numbers flickered across massive screens, projections, metrics, forecasts, each one feeding into a system that had always been trusted, always been reliable, until now. And Victoria Hale stood at the head of the long table, her posture as composed as ever, one hand resting lightly on the back of a leather chair, the other holding a tablet filled with real-time updates, while her senior team moved quickly around her, voices low but urgent. The sync delay is increasing, one analyst said, fingers moving rapidly across a keyboard. We are seeing inconsistencies in the data streams, another added, trying to keep his tone measured, and Victoria's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in panic, but in calculation. Then fix it, she said, her voice even, controlled, the kind of authority that expected solutions, not explanations. And for a moment, the room obeyed that expectation, people leaning in, typing faster, calling up additional diagnostics. But the system did not respond the way it always had. It hesitated, it looped, it resisted, and on the largest screen, a sequence of numbers froze for half a second longer than it should have, just long enough for doubt to slip into the room. And one of the executives cleared his throat. We are about 20 minutes from the live partner review, he said carefully. If this is not resolved, he did not finish the sentence, because he did not need to, and Victoria set the tablet down, her reflection catching faintly in the glass behind her, steady but now watching something she could not yet control. Run a full system check, she said, sharper this time. Every layer, every integration. And the team moved again, faster now, less confident, while outside the conference room, assistants whispered, messages were sent, the quiet hum of the building rising just enough to signal that something was wrong, even if no one said it out loud. And down in the operations center, screens began to mirror the same issue, small inconsistencies spreading like cracks beneath a surface that had always looked flawless. And one technician leaned back slightly, frowning. This does not make sense, he murmured. It is like the system is rejecting its own logic. And another shook his head. We have never seen this before. And somewhere in that rising uncertainty, a memory flickered, faint but persistent, a quiet voice at the entrance earlier that morning. You might want to check your system before noon. And the technician paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Did anyone log that external request from earlier? He asked, glancing at his colleague, who shrugged. Just some guy at the front desk. Security turned him away, and the technician hesitated just for a second, then shook it off. Because in a building like this, problems were solved internally, by experts, by teams, by systems designed to prevent failure. And yet the failure was unfolding anyway, quiet at first, then undeniable. And back in the conference room, one of the screens went dark for a fraction of a second before flashing back with an error line that had never appeared before. And this time, no one spoke immediately, because something had changed, something deeper than a simple glitch. And Victoria looked at the screen, her jaw tightening just slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that control was slipping. And for the first time that morning, the room did not feel like it belonged entirely to her. And somewhere far from the glass and steel, in a small kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and quiet resilience, a man who had already seen the problem was finishing his coffee, unaware, or perhaps fully aware that soon, the same people who had not seen him would be forced to look again. By late morning, the rhythm inside Hale Dynamics had fractured into something unfamiliar, something unsteady, and the quiet confidence that once filled every hallway had thinned into whispers and quickened footsteps. While in the executive conference room, the large screens no longer displayed clean projections, but flickered with cascading inconsistencies, numbers repeating, freezing, correcting themselves only to break again. And Victoria Hale stood motionless for a moment, her eyes scanning the data with sharp precision, refusing to accept what she was seeing, because systems like hers did not fail, not without warning, not without reason. And yet the warning had come, soft, almost invisible, spoken by someone she had not even acknowledged. And across the table, one of her senior engineers spoke, his voice tighter now. We are isolating the issue, but it is not responding to standard overrides. And another added, it is affecting multiple layers, not just the front end. And Victoria turned slightly, her gaze cutting through the noise, then stopped describing it and fix it, she said, her tone controlled but edged with something new, something closer to urgency. And the room moved again, faster, more chaotic, keyboards clicking in uneven bursts, voices overlapping. But the system did not yield. It resisted every command like a lock that had forgotten its own key. And down in the operations center, a junior analyst stared at his screen, his brow furrowed as he traced the anomaly back through layers of code, deeper, further than anyone else had gone that morning. And then he paused, his fingers hovering. This pattern, he murmured, almost to himself, it is not random. And his colleague leaned over, squinting at the lines of data. What do you mean? And the analyst swallowed, pointing to a sequence buried beneath the surface. It looks like a recursive loop triggered by a legacy structure, something that should not even be active anymore. And the colleague blinked, confused. But that system was phased out years ago. And the analyst nodded slowly, his voice dropping. Unless someone knew it was still there. And back upstairs, the tension had thickened into something that pressed against every breath. And Victoria stepped away from the table, walking toward the window where the city stretched out below, steady and indifferent, her reflection staring back at her, composed but no longer untouchable. And for a brief second, her mind returned to the entrance, to the man with the quiet voice and the worn folder, to the sentence she had dismissed without thought. And she turned back sharply. Security, she called. And within seconds, a voice answered through her assistant's earpiece. Yes, ma'am. And she hesitated, just a fraction, as if measuring something she was not used to questioning. The man from this morning, she said, her words precise. The one at the entrance. Did he leave? And there was a pause on the other end, a shuffle of movement. We escorted him out. Ma'am, he did not cause any issues. And Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something she had overlooked, something that did not fit the pattern she relied on. And she exhaled slowly, the room watching her now, waiting for direction, waiting for certainty. and she gave neither immediately, because for the first time that day, she was not entirely sure where the solution would come from. And somewhere across town, Ethan Cole stood in a small hardware store aisle, comparing the weight of two simple tools in his hands, his movements unhurried, his focus grounded in things that worked the way they were meant to, unaware, or perhaps fully aware that in a building of glass and power, the problem he had already seen was growing louder, more insistent, and closer to the moment when silence would no longer be a choice. The clock on the conference room wall moved with quiet indifference, each second passing without hesitation, without concern for the tension building beneath it, and at exactly 11:42. The first external call dropped, not with noise, not with alarm, but with a simple flicker on the screen that should not have happened, and one of the executives leaned forward, his voice low but unmistakably strained. "We just lost the Westbridge connection." And another screen followed, then another, each one blinking out of sync like a system forgetting how to breathe, and Victoria Hale stood still at the center of it all, her hands resting lightly on the table now, her posture still, composed but no longer untouched, and across from her, the legal advisor spoke quickly. "If the partners cannot access the live data, they will delay the signing." And someone else added, "Delay means doubt." And the room understood what came next without needing to say it, because in their world, doubt was more dangerous than failure. It spread faster, it lingered longer, and Victoria lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady but sharper now. "Get them back online," she said, and the engineers moved again, faster, more desperate, running scripts, resetting nodes, pushing commands into a system that no longer responded the way it was supposed to. And down in the operations center, the same analyst who had noticed the anomaly earlier was now leaning over his desk, eyes scanning line after line of code, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is escalating," he said. "The loop is feeding into the primary network." And his colleague shook his head. "That is not possible." And the analyst did not argue. He simply pointed to the screen, where the data now repeated in tighter cycles, faster, more unstable, and back upstairs. One of the largest screens went completely dark for 2 full seconds before returning with a corrupted display, numbers misaligned, symbols out of place, and this time, no one tried to explain it immediately, because explanation required understanding. And understanding was slipping away, and Victoria exhaled slowly, her eyes moving from one screen to another, measuring, calculating, searching for control in a system that was no longer offering it. And then she spoke again, quieter this time, but carrying more weight. "How long before total shutdown?" And the lead engineer hesitated, his fingers still on the keyboard. "If this continues," he said carefully, 15 minutes, maybe less." And the room fell into a silence that was not calm, not peaceful, but heavy, pressing, the kind of silence that comes when certainty disappears. And in that moment, the memory returned again, clearer now, sharper, the quiet voice at the entrance, the man who had not argued, had not insisted, had simply said what needed to be said, and Victoria turned abruptly, her decision made not from habit, but from something deeper, something she was not used to relying on. "Find him," she said, her voice cutting through the room with a new kind of urgency. "I want that man back here." And her assistant blinked, surprised but quick to respond, already signaling security, already sending messages through the building. And as the order moved through the system, faster than the failing code itself, the contrast was unmistakable, one system breaking, another scrambling to correct what had been overlooked. And far from the glass towers, in a quiet aisle of a hardware store, Ethan Cole stood at the counter, placing a small box of screws beside a worn pair of work gloves, his movements steady, his focus grounded, while the cashier scanned the items with a casual rhythm, unaware that somewhere across town, a company worth billions was unraveling. And as Ethan reached for his wallet, his phone vibrated softly in his pocket, a sound so small it almost went unnoticed, but not quite, and he paused, just for a second, before pulling it out, the screen lighting up with an unknown number, and around him, the world remained simple, unchanged, while on the other end of that call, urgency waited, searching for a man it had failed to see before time ran out. The phone vibrated once more in Ethan Cole's hand, a quiet insistence that did not match the calm rhythm of the hardware store around him, and for a moment, He simply looked at the screen, the unknown number glowing softly, as if weighing whether urgency deserved his attention, and then he answered, lifting it to his ear with the same steady composure he carried everywhere. "Hello," he said, his voice low, grounded, and on the other end, there was a brief pause, followed by a voice that was trying to remain professional but could not fully hide the strain beneath it. "Sir, this is Hale Dynamics. We need to speak with you immediately." And Ethan glanced toward the counter where the cashier was placing his items into a small paper bag, the ordinary world continuing without interruption, and he replied simply, "I already tried to speak with you." And there was another pause, longer this time, the weight of that truth settling on the caller. "Yes, sir," the voice said, quieter now. "We understand that. But the situation has changed," and Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, not surprised, not satisfied, just aware. "It usually does," he said, and across town, inside the glass tower, Victoria Hale stood near the center of the conference room, her phone now in her hand, her assistant standing beside her, waiting, while the screens behind them flickered with unstable data, and the room had grown quieter, not from calm, but from the realization that control had slipped beyond their reach, and she took a breath, steady but deliberate, before stepping forward and taking the call herself. "This is Victoria Hale," she said, her voice clear, direct, but carrying something new beneath it, something closer to humility than authority. And on the other end, Ethan did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because silence, for him, was never empty. It was space to think, to measure, to choose. And then he spoke. "You are running out of time," he said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. And in the conference room, several heads turned toward Victoria, the shift in tone unmistakable, and she closed her eyes for just a fraction of a second before answering. "I know," she said, and those two words, so small, carried more weight than anything she had said all morning, because they were not backed by certainty, only by truth. And she continued, "Can you come back?" And the room seemed to hold its breath, not because they knew who Ethan was, but because they sensed something had changed in the way she was asking. And Ethan looked down at the bag in his hand, then toward the store entrance where sunlight spilled across the floor, warm and steady, and he spoke again, calm as ever. "I never left for them," he said quietly. "I left because I was told to." And Victoria swallowed, the words landing with a clarity she could not ignore, and for the first time, she did not try to defend it, did not justify it. She simply accepted it. "Then I am asking you now," she said, her voice softer but no less firm. "Please come back." And around her, the room had gone completely still, the usual confidence replaced by something more fragile, more human, and Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, not out of pride, but as if acknowledging the moment for what it was. And then he said, "I will be there in 20 minutes. And the line went quiet, not abruptly, not dramatically, just ending with the same calm it began with. And Victoria lowered the phone slightly, her reflection catching once more in the glass behind her. But this time, it did not look untouchable. It looked aware, and as she turned back to the room, she did not offer explanations, did not restore control with words. She simply said, "Hold everything." And outside, in a small parking lot under a wide, open sky, Ethan Cole placed the paper bag on the passenger seat of his truck, started the engine, and pulled onto the road, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward, while behind him, the quiet life he had built remained steady, and ahead of him, a world that had failed to see him, prepared to fall completely silent. The drive back into the city moved at a steady pace, the hum of Ethan Cole's truck blending with the distant rhythm of traffic and the low murmur of a world that had no idea how close it was to shifting. And as the skyline of glass and steel grew larger in the windshield, his expression remained unchanged, calm, focused, not driven by urgency, but by clarity, because some problems were not solved by rushing. They were solved by understanding. And when he pulled into the circular driveway of Hale Dynamics 23 minutes later, the same polished entrance stood waiting, but the energy had changed, the security guard now standing straighter, watching more carefully. And as Ethan stepped out of the truck, closing the door with a quiet click, the guard approached quickly, not with dismissal this time, but with hesitation. "Sir," he said, his tone uncertain. "They are expecting you." And Ethan gave a small nod, not acknowledging the shift, not holding on to it either, just moving forward, and the glass doors opened again. But this time, they did not feel like a barrier. They felt like a passage into something unfinished. And inside, the lobby no longer carried its earlier confidence. Conversations had lowered, movements had slowed, and as Ethan walked across the marble floor, a few employees glanced up, their expressions no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but searching, uncertain, trying to place him in a system that had not accounted for him before, and the elevator doors opened without delay, as if the building itself had learned something. And when he stepped inside, a staff member pressed the top floor button without asking, her voice quiet. "They are all waiting." And Ethan simply replied, "I know," and the elevator rose in smooth silence, each floor passing like a measured breath, and when the doors opened, the hallway beyond was still, unusually still, as if even the air had paused, and at the end of it, the conference room doors stood open, revealing a space filled with people who were no longer speaking, no longer pretending control, and Victoria Hale stood at the center, her posture still composed, but her eyes now fixed on the entrance. And when Ethan stepped into the room, no one announced him, no one questioned him, because something about the moment made introductions unnecessary, and for a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. The only sound the faint hum of failing systems in the background, and Victoria took a single step forward, not commanding, not distant, but deliberate. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady but stripped of its earlier edge, and Ethan looked at her, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, just with quiet recognition. "Show me," he said, and one of the engineers quickly turned a monitor toward him, explaining in rushed detail what had already gone wrong, pointing at the loops, the delays, the breakdown across layers. But Ethan did not interrupt, did not react. He simply listened, his eyes moving across the screen with a familiarity that did not need to prove itself. And then he stepped closer, placing his hand lightly on the edge of the table, leaning in just enough to see what others had missed, and the room watched him. Not because they understood what he was about to do, but because they no longer had anything else to rely on. And after a moment, Ethan spoke, his voice calm, precise. "You are not dealing with a failure," he said, and the room leaned in, drawn to the certainty in his tone. "You are dealing with something you never fully removed." And one of the engineers frowned. "That is not possible," he said instinctively, and Ethan glanced at him briefly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just steady. "It is already happening," he replied, and then he reached forward, his fingers moving across the keyboard with controlled simplicity, not rushing, not hesitating, entering commands that no one else had considered. And for the first time since the problem began, the room did not react with noise, with panic, or with doubt. It reacted with silence, the kind of silence that forms when people realize they are witnessing something they do not yet understand. And as the first lines of corrected data began to stabilize on the screen, a subtle shift passed through the room. Not relief, not yet, but something closer to recognition. And Victoria stood still, watching him, her earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something deeper, as she began to understand that the man she had not seen was the only one who had truly understood what they were facing all along. The room did not move, did not breathe the way it had before, because something fundamental had shifted, and as Ethan Cole continued working at the console, his movements remained steady, deliberate, untouched by the tension that surrounded him, while the screens that had once flickered with instability began to respond differently, not fully restored, not yet stable, but no longer collapsing. And one of the engineers leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The recursion loop is slowing." And another added, "It is isolating." And Ethan did not look up, did not acknowledge the commentary. He simply adjusted a sequence, his fingers moving with quiet precision. And then he spoke. "You buried a legacy structure inside your core system," he said calmly. "It was never fully removed, just hidden beneath layers that assumed it would never activate again." And the lead engineer frowned, stepping forward. "That system was retired over a decade ago," he said, his voice carrying both disbelief and a trace of defensiveness. And Ethan glanced at him briefly, his expression unchanged, Retired is not the same as removed, he replied, and the simplicity of that statement settled over the room heavier than any technical explanation could have, and on the main screen, a sequence of data realigned itself, not perfectly, but clearly, undeniably, and a soft sound escaped from somewhere near the back of the room. Not applause, not relief, just the quiet release of breath that comes when something impossible begins to make sense. And Victoria Hale stood still, her eyes fixed on the screen, then on Ethan, then back again, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the assumption she had made earlier that morning, and she stepped closer, her voice measured but no longer distant. "How did you see it so quickly?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a question she genuinely needed answered. And Ethan paused for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the console. "Because I have seen it before," he said, and that answer did not explain everything, but it changed everything. And one of the senior executives turned sharply. "Seen it where?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended, and Ethan met his gaze without resistance. "Here," he said simply, and the room went still again, not confused this time, but listening, truly listening, and the same analyst from earlier stepped forward, his voice uncertain but growing clearer. "Wait," he said, scrolling quickly through archived records, the original architecture design, and his eyes widened slightly as he found the name. "Ethan Cole," he read aloud, and the words seemed to echo without sound, because recognition does not always need volume. Sometimes it arrives in silence, and another engineer leaned in, confirming it. "He designed the base framework," he said quietly, and suddenly the room was not just watching Ethan. They were seeing him, not as a stranger, not as an outsider, but as the origin of something they had been trying to control without fully understanding. And Victoria's expression changed, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in the way her posture softened just slightly, the way her eyes held something deeper than authority, something closer to respect. And Ethan returned his focus to the system, entering one final sequence, and for a moment, everything held still, the screens, the room, the air itself, and then the data stabilized, clean, aligned, responsive, the system returning not with noise, but with quiet certainty, and no one spoke, because there are moments when words feel smaller than what just happened, and in that silence, the kind that does not need to be filled, Victoria understood something she had missed before, not about the system, not about the failure, but about the man she had chosen not to see. And for the first time since the morning began, the room was not waiting for control to return, it was standing in the presence of something far more powerful, quiet competence, undeniable truth, and the kind of dignity that never needed to announce itself to be real. No one moved at first, not because they were unsure, but because the moment did not belong to movement, it belonged to understanding. And as the system continued running smoothly, clean data flowing across every screen with quiet precision, the absence of chaos felt louder than anything that had come before it. And Ethan Cole stepped back from the console, not waiting for acknowledgement, not looking for approval, simply giving the system one last glance, as if confirming what he already knew. And then he turned slightly, his posture relaxed, his presence unchanged, while around him, the room remained suspended in that rare kind of silence that follows truth. And Victoria Hale watched him carefully, not as a CEO observing a solution, but as someone witnessing a reality she had not prepared for. And after a moment, she took a step forward, her voice steady but different now, stripped of distance. "You built this," she said, not as a question, but as something she was still learning how to accept. And Ethan met her gaze briefly, his expression calm. "A long time ago," he replied. And one of the executives shifted, still trying to reconcile the simplicity of that answer with the magnitude of what had just happened. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, his tone carrying confusion more than accusation, and Ethan glanced toward the screens, then back at the room. "I did," he said quietly, and the words settled over them. Not sharp, not loud, but undeniable, and no one responded immediately, because there are moments when truth does not need to be defended, it only needs to be heard. And Victoria inhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the weight of the morning finally found its place. "I should have listened," she said, and it was not a statement for the room. It was not a performance. It was simply honest, and Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, not in judgment, just in acknowledgement, and he picked up his folder from the table, the same worn leather that had been dismissed at the door hours earlier, and turned toward the exit, his steps unhurried, his focus already moving beyond the room. And Victoria spoke again, this time with something closer to urgency. "Wait," she said, and he paused, not fully turning, just enough to show he had heard her, and she stepped closer, closing the